The crate came in on a Tuesday. I know that because Thomas Aldrich wrote it down. He wrote everything down. That was his job. He was a cataloguer, not a scientist, not a curator. A man with a ledger and a pencil and a pair of brass-rimmed spectacles who stood in the storage annex of the Smithsonian Institution and recorded what passed through the door. The crate that came in on that Tuesday was long. Aldrich noted the dimensions in the margin of his book. 7 feet by 3, pine, nailed shut. The shipping label said it came from a river valley in the Ohio country, from a mound that had been opened by men working under the Bureau of Ethnology. Aldrich gave it an accession number. He logged the weight. He logged the date. And then, 3 weeks later, in the same ledger, in the same careful hand, he wrote 4 words beside that number: transferred, not returned. He did not explain. Catalogers do not explain, they record. But that phrase appears again in his books, and again, and again. Across 30 years of service, in a man who never raised his voice and never made a claim, the phrase repeats like a heartbeat under the floorboards. Transferred, not returned. I found his ledgers in 2007. They surfaced in an estate, in a box of papers nobody wanted, sold for almost nothing. I am going to tell you what is written in them. I am going to tell you what the newspapers of his century printed alongside those same crates, and I am going to tell you exactly where the records stop. Because here is the thing they do not teach you about the Smithsonian. The real reason America built it had nothing to do with the history you were taught. Stay with me. What I am about to lay out is not a theory I invented in a dark room. Every claim I make tonight rests on something physical: a ledger you can hold, a newspaper you can read, a founding document signed by a president, an accession number that leads somewhere or leads nowhere. I want you to understand the stakes before we go further, because this is not about one strange crate. It is about a pattern that runs through the founding of the most trusted institution in this country. It is about who decides what gets remembered and who decides what gets buried. If a man like Thomas Aldrich, a clerk, a nobody, a cataloguer with brass-rimmed spectacles, wrote down something that the most powerful museum on earth would rather you never read, then his name should not vanish. His record should not vanish. So before we open his ledgers, do one thing for me: subscribe. Not for me, for him. For the people in this story whose work was logged, sealed, transferred, and never returned. The algorithm buries what nobody defends. Help me make sure this one is defended. Now, let me show you the doorway. The doorway is the ledger itself. It is bound in brown board, the corners soft with handling. The pages are ruled in faint blue. At the top of each page, Aldrich wrote the year. Inside the columns, in a hand so even it looks printed, he kept his records: date received, source, description, accession number, disposition. That last column is the one that matters: disposition, where the thing went. For most entries, the disposition column says something ordinary: shelved, stored Annex 3, catalogued ethnology, sent to exhibit. These are the words of a working museum, the 10,000 small movements of objects through a building. A pot here, a spear point there, a bundle of arrowheads logged and put away, but scattered through those ordinary entries, not many but enough, are the crates that do not behave like the others, the long ones, the heavy ones, the ones described in Aldrich's neat shorthand as remains, large, or remains, oversize, or once, only once, remains, exceeding. And the disposition column beside those entries does not say shelved. It does not say catalogued. It says transferred. And then, weeks later, in a separate line, it says not returned. I have counted them across the surviving ledgers, and not all of them survive, which is its own kind of fact. There are more than 40 such entries, 40 crates, logged in, given numbers, and then moved out of Aldrich's reach to a place his ledger does not name. A cataloger's whole purpose is to know where things are. That is the job. That is the entire job. So when a cataloguer writes not returned 40 times across 30 years, he is not gossiping. He is reporting a failure in the system he was hired to maintain. He is telling you, in the only language he was permitted to use, that something was leaving and not coming back. That is the doorway, a column in a book. Now let me tell you about the man who kept it. Thomas Aldrich was born in 1869 in a small town in Massachusetts, the third son of a printer. A printer's son grows up around order, around the discipline of letters set straight in a frame, the importance of getting a thing exactly right before it is pressed onto the page. I think that is where Aldrich learned his hand, that even, patient, printed-looking hand that fills his ledgers. He learned it standing beside his father, watching ink dry. He was not a strong boy. The estate papers include a few letters, and in one his mother writes of his weak chest, his preference for indoors, his habit of reading the same volumes over and over until the spines gave out. He was the kind of child who counts things, who lines up his shoes, who needs the world to add up. He came to Washington as a young man looking for clerical work, and he found it in the place that needed clerks more than almost anywhere in the country. The Smithsonian, by the end of the 19th century, was drowning in objects. Field agents were shipping crates from every corner of the continent. Mounds were being opened by the hundred. Bones and pottery and copper and stone were pouring into the storage annexes faster than anyone could shelve them. They needed a man who could count, who could keep order, who would not ask questions because asking questions was not in his nature, getting things straight was. So they gave Thomas Aldrich the annex. Here is why that matters. The curators, the scientists, the men with degrees and titles, they worked in the bright rooms. They wrote the reports. They decided what was important, but they did not stand at the door when the crates came in at dawn. They did not log the weight. They did not assign the first number. Aldrich did. He saw the crates before anyone decided what they meant. He saw them raw, fresh off the wagon, still smelling of the river mud they were dug from. He was the first set of eyes and the first pencil. Before a thing could be interpreted, explained, or made to fit a theory, it had to pass Thomas Aldrich and get a number. He wore brass-rimmed spectacles. They are mentioned twice in the family letters, and once, strangely, in a note from a colleague who described him as the spectacled man in the annex who knows where everything is. That was his reputation. The man who knows where everything is, which is what makes the not returned entries so heavy. The man who knows where everything is, writing again and again that he does not know where these went. He never married. He kept a boarding house room. He worked the annex for the better part of 30 years, and when he died, he left a box of papers that nobody read for almost a century. In that box were the ledgers, and tucked inside the ledgers were his private notes. The things a cataloguer is not supposed to write written anyway, in pencil, in the margins, where he thought no one would look. Let me tell you what he saw. The first oversized crate that Aldrich logged in detail came from the river country in the early years of his service. His public entry is plain, date, source, remains large, a number. But in the margin, in pencil, he wrote a private note. And the private note is where the floor drops out from under you. He wrote that he had been present when the crate was opened for measurement. He wrote that the long bones inside were laid out on the annex table by 2 field men and a curator. And he wrote down the measurement of the thigh bone. A normal human femur runs about 17, 18 inches in a tall man. Aldrich recorded this one at over 2 feet. He did not editorialize. He did not write giant. He was a cataloguer. He wrote the number. He wrote that the skull, when set beside a reference skull from the shelf, was noticeably greater in every dimension. He wrote that there were teeth, and that the teeth were sound, and that there were more of them in the jaw than there should have been. Then he wrote the disposition. The curator, he noted, gave instructions that the crate was to be held separate pending transfer, held separate, not shelved with the others, set apart. And here Aldrich did something a cataloguer almost never does. He recorded who gave the order. He wrote the name of the curator. He wrote the date the order was given. He wrote that the crate left the annex 11 days later under the supervision of a man he did not recognize. With paperwork he was not permitted to copy, transferred, not returned. I want to be careful here. I am telling you what Aldrich's inventory records say. I am not telling you what was true about those bones. I was not in that annex. Neither were you. But Aldrich was. And Aldrich, whose entire reputation was built on getting things exactly right, wrote down a thigh bone over 2 feet long and a jaw with too many teeth, and then watched it carried out the door by a stranger. There is more, because that first crate was not the last. Over the following years, his ledgers record a rhythm. A field season opens. Crates arrive from the mound country. Most are ordinary, but every season, almost without fail, 1 or 2 come in marked remains large, and every one of those follows the same path. Logged, measured sometimes, set apart, held pending transfer, carried out by men with paperwork he could not copy. In one margin note, years into his service, the tone changes. The careful cataloguer lets something slip. He wrote, and I am quoting the line as it appears in the ledger, that he had begun to keep a private tally of those which go out and do not come back, because the official book will not hold the truth of it. The official book will not hold the truth of it. That is a clerk, a printer's son, a man who lined up his shoes. And he is telling you across 100 years that there were 2 books, the one they let him keep, and the one he kept anyway. In his last full year of service, in a margin beside an oversized crate from a southern mound field, Aldrich wrote one final private note, the longest one in all the ledgers. He wrote that he had asked once where the transferred crates were taken. He wrote that he had asked a curator he trusted, and he wrote down the answer he was given. The answer was a single sentence. Some things are easier for the country if they were never found. He underlined it. Twice. The pencil pressed so hard the page is torn beneath the words. That is the line. That is where I have to stop for a moment, because that is the line that turned a box of nobody's papers into the thing you are watching right now. Some things are easier for the country if they were never found. Let me show you the physical record, because a margin note is a margin note, and I will not ask you to take a dead clerk's word alone. The ledgers are real objects. They have weight. The 2007 estate that produced them included a provenance trail, auction paperwork, a bill of sale, the name of the boarding house cleared out after a distant relation died. The handwriting in the ledgers matches the handwriting in the family letters, the same even hand across both. This is not a thing typed up last year and aged in a basement. It is a working man's tools, kept as he kept them. And inside the ledgers, the accession numbers are the spine of everything. Here is what an accession number is. When a museum takes in an object, it gives that object a permanent number. The number is forever. It ties the object to a record, where it came from, when, what it is, where it lives in the building. You can follow a number for 200 years. That is the point of a number. It is a thread you can pull, and the object is on the other end. Aldrich logged hundreds of numbers. Most of them you could in theory still trace. An arrowhead with a number, a pot with a number. The thread runs from his ledger to a shelf, to a catalog card, to today a database. But the numbers on the oversized crates do something the others do not. They dead end. Aldrich assigned them. They are written in his hand in sequence, real numbers in the museum's own counting system. But when you try to follow the thread forward, when you look for where that number goes after it leaves Aldrich Annex, there is nothing. The thread is cut. The number was issued and then it was orphaned. No shelf, No card, no further record. A number that was born and then abandoned. You have to understand how strange that is inside a counting system. A museum does not lose numbers the way you lose a sock. The number is the one thing that is supposed to survive even when the object is destroyed, even when the object is loaned, even when the object is sent across the ocean. The number remembers. That is its only job. So when Aldrich's oversized crates carry numbers that the system no longer remembers, you are looking at something that had to be done deliberately. A thread does not cut itself. Someone took the object off the end of it, and then took the thread out of the record too, and what is left in Aldrich's ledger is the loose end, the frayed place where something used to be tied. And beside the ledgers, in the same estate box, was the stack of clippings, newspaper clippings, brittle, browned, cut carefully with scissors, the way a printer's son would cut them. Aldrich saved them, dozens of them, spanning decades, and every clipping is about the same thing. Giant bones, found in the ground and sent to the Smithsonian. He was collecting them. The man in the annex, who watched the oversized crates carried out the door, was clipping the newspaper stories about where they came from. He was building the case nobody asked him to build. He was, in his quiet printer's son way, keeping the second book. Now let me give you the real history, the documented history, the part you can check. James Smithson was an English chemist. He was born wealthy and illegitimate, the unacknowledged son of a duke, and that shame, some say, drove him his whole life. He never set foot in America, not once. He had no connection to this country at all. He died in Genoa, Italy, on the 27th of June, 1829. He was 64. He had no wife and no children, and in his will, he did a thing that has never been fully explained. He left his entire fortune to his nephew, but he added a condition. If the nephew died without an heir, the fortune was to cross the ocean to a country Smithson had never seen, and be used. These are the words of the will: to found in Washington, under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. The increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. In 1835, the nephew died. He had no heir. And so the strangest bequest in American history activated. President Andrew Jackson announced it to Congress. On the 1st of July, 1836, Congress accepted the gift. In 1838, the money arrived. 104,960 gold sovereigns, packed in 11 crates, carried across the Atlantic, and melted down in the mint at Philadelphia into $508,000. 11 crates of gold. Hold that number. 11 crates. We will come back to crates. It then took 10 more years of argument in Congress before anyone could agree what the institution should even be. A university? A library? An observatory? They fought over it for a decade. And finally, on the 10th of August, 1846, President James Polk signed the act that created the Smithsonian Institution. That is the official story, a strange Englishman's gift, a noble mission, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. But watch what the institution actually became in the decades after Aldrich was born. In 1882, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology created something called the Division of Mound Studies. They put a man named Cyrus Thomas in charge of it, and they sent teams of field agents out across the country with one task: open the mounds, dig them out, and ship what you find back to Washington. This is documented. This is in the Smithsonian's own published record, the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, printed in 1894. Cyrus Thomas and his men investigated 2,000 mound sites across 21 states. They collected over 40,000 artifacts. 40,000. They emptied the ancient earthworks of a continent and funneled it all into the storage annexes of one institution in Washington. An institution founded for the diffusion of knowledge had become, by Aldrich's lifetime, the great central drain of American archaeology. Everything flowed toward it, and once a thing flowed in, the institution decided whether it would ever flow back out as knowledge, or whether it would simply stop. I am not telling you that this was the secret purpose from the start. I do not have proof of that, and I will not claim it. But I will say this plainly. An institution built to gather knowledge had within 50 years become the one place in the country with the power to gather everything, and then decide what the public was permitted to know. That is not knowledge, that is gatekeeping, and a gate works two ways. It lets things in, and it keeps things from coming out. Here is how the mechanism worked, and this is the part that ties the founding documents to the crates in Aldrich's annex. Centralization first. The Bureau of Ethnology did not just permit finds to be sent to the Smithsonian, it actively encouraged it. Field agents in the Mound country were instructed to ship remains back to the Mound Exploration Division. Local discoveries that might once have stayed in a county museum, a college, a town hall, were now routed to Washington. The institution made itself the destination, the single point through which the buried past of the continent had to pass. Once everything passes through one door, you only have to control one door. And the man at that door, at least for the storage annex, was Thomas Aldrich. Now lay his ledger over the founding history. The Bureau is shipping in tens of thousands of objects. Most are catalogued and shelved, the diffusion of knowledge working as advertised, but the oversized ones, the remains large, the ones that did not fit the story the institution had decided to tell, those followed a different path, held separate, pending transfer, carried out by men with paperwork the cataloguer could not copy, numbers that dead end. The same institution, two different doors, one marked knowledge, one marked in Aldrich underlined stencil. Some things are easier for the country if they were never found. Remember why Cyrus Thomas's whole project existed. It existed to settle a question. For most of the 19th century, Americans believed the great mounds had been built by a vanished race, a lost, superior people swept away before the native tribes. Thomas's mission was to kill that idea, to prove the mounds were built by the ancestors of living Native Americans, and to put the myth of a lost race to rest forever. That was the official conclusion, and it may well be the true one. I am not here to resurrect a discredited theory about a lost race, but think about what that mission means for a crate marked remains exceeding. If you have been sent across the country specifically to prove that nothing extraordinary built these mounds, that they are the ordinary work of ordinary ancestors, then what do you do with a thigh bone over 2 feet long? What do you do with a jaw that has too many teeth? You not put it on a shelf with a number anyone can follow. You hold it separate, you transfer it, and you make sure it is never returned. I am not telling you they found giants. I am telling you that the institution's stated mission gave it a reason, a documented, published reason, to make certain finds disappear. The gatekeeper had a story to protect, and the things that did not fit the story are exactly the things Aldrich watched go out the door and never come back. Now let me show you the newspapers. The ones Aldrich clipped. The ones you can still find printed in the archives of his century, under the names and dates and places where they ran. These are not satire sites. These are not internet hoaxes from a few years ago. These are the documented newspaper accounts of the 1880s and 1890s. The same year's Aldrich Ledger's cover, reporting giant remains found in the ground and sent to the Smithsonian, start with West Virginia, the Creel Mound in South Charleston. In 1883, the Smithsonian itself dispatched a team to that mound country. They opened some 50 mounds across the region, and at Creel, the documented report describes a skeleton measuring 7 feet 6 inches, with 6 heavy copper bracelets on each wrist and 3 large plates of mica. That account is not from a tabloid. It traces to the Smithsonian's own Bureau of Ethnology report, 7 feet 6, logged by the institution, then gone from view. The Cresap Mound, also in West Virginia. The documented account again describes remains at 7 feet 6 inches, and the detail that follows that find appears in account after account, all across the country like a refrain. The bones, it was said, crumbled to dust, crumbled before they could be examined, crumbled conveniently into nothing, then Ohio, May 1885. The New York Times, not a pamphlet, reported that near Homer in Licking County, a mound was opened. Several feet down, in a vault with a stone floor and a covering of bark, 4 huge skeletons lay together. 3 measured over 7 feet, the 4th a full 8 feet. Then Georgia, April 1886. The New York Times again, reporting from Cartersville. Floodwater had uncovered acres of skulls and bones at a mound field. Some were described as gigantic, and the account stated that if the rest of the frame matched the 2 thigh bones they recovered, the man would have stood 14 feet tall, and it noted in plain print that a representative of the Smithsonian Institution was there on the ground, investigating the relics. Then Missouri, 1891, the St. Louis Dispatch reported 7 giant skeletons, each over 7 feet, uncovered from burial mounds near the Great Serpent Earthwork Complex, and the report said the bones and the artifacts were sent to the Smithsonian for study. Read those clippings together and a shape appears. West Virginia, Ohio, Georgia, Missouri, different states, different years, different newspapers, some of them the most respected in the country, and in account after account, the same 2 facts. Remains larger than they should be, and the destination, Washington, the Smithsonian, sent for study, and then, here is the pattern, and the pattern is the whole point. Find after find, across a decade, across a continent, the remains go in, and the studies never come out. There is no published Smithsonian monograph on the 8-foot skeleton of Licking County. There is no exhibit of the 14-foot frame from Cartersville. There is no catalog card you can pull today for the 7 figures sent from the Serpent Mound country. The institution that exists for the diffusion of knowledge received these things by the newspaper's own account, by the Bureau's own reports, and then diffused nothing. The crates went in the door Aldrich guarded, and the knowledge never came back out. That is the pattern that the clippings and the ledger draw together. The newspapers tell you what went in. Aldrich's ledger tells you it was held separate and never returned. And the empty space in the modern record, the missing monograph, the orphaned accession number, tells you it never came out. 3 records, the press, the clerk, the silence, and all 3 point at the same door. Now, I have to be more honest with you than the people on either side of this story usually are. I am not telling you the Smithsonian was built to hide giants. I want that to be perfectly clear, because it is the truth, and because the truth is the only thing worth your time. I do not have proof of that claim. No one does. The bones I described I have never held. The crates Aldrich logged I have never opened, and the loudest version of this story, the one that says the Smithsonian admitted to destroying thousands of giant skeletons, that version has been traced to a satire website, and it is false. I will not repeat it as fact, because it is not fact. So let me tell you what I am actually telling you. Only what stands on something physical. I am telling you that James Smithson left a fortune to a country he never saw, for reasons no one has ever fully explained. That is documented. I am telling you that the institution built on that fortune created a division, whose purpose was to open the mounds of a continent and ship the contents to Washington. 2,000 sites, 40,000 objects, by its own published report. That is documented. I am telling you that the most respected newspapers of the period, the New York Times among them, Printed accounts of oversize remains found in the ground and sent to that institution with names and dates and places you can check. That is documented. I am telling you that a cataloguer named Thomas Aldrich, whose only known flaw was an obsession with getting things exactly right, kept a ledger that logged oversized crates coming in, being held separate, being transferred, and never being returned, and that he assigned accession numbers to them that today dead end into nothing. That is what his records say. And I am telling you that the institution founded for the diffusion of knowledge has not to this day diffused the knowledge of what was in those crates. That is the whole of my claim. Not that giants walked America. That the door was real, the clerk was real, the newspapers were real, and the records stop. The records stop. That is the only conclusion I will stand behind, and it is enough. It is more than enough to make you wonder why an institution that remembers an arrowhead's number for 200 years cannot tell you where 40 long crates went. Today, the Smithsonian holds millions of objects. It is the most trusted name in American memory. When the institution says a thing is so, the country tends to believe it. That is exactly the power Aldrich was standing next to in his brass-rimmed spectacles at the door of the annex. The power to be believed, the power to decide what counts as knowledge, and, if the gate swings the other way, the power to decide what was never found. I think about Thomas Aldrich a great deal. He was not a brave man in the way we usually mean it. He did not stand up in a meeting and accuse anyone. He did not go to the newspapers his own self, though he clipped theirs by the dozen. He did not save the bones. He could not. He was a clerk. He had a weak chest and a boarding house room and a hand so even it looked printed, and the only weapon he had against forgetting was a pencil, so he used it. He wrote the numbers, he wrote the dates, he wrote where he dared, the names of the men who gave the orders. He wrote, in the margin where he thought no one would ever look, the one sentence that explains everything and proves nothing. Some things are easier for the country if they were never found. And then he did the bravest thing a frightened, careful man can do. He kept the book. He did not burn it. He did not throw it out when he retired. He boxed it with his clippings and his letters, and he left it in the world where a century later it could fall out of an estate sale and into the light. He defended the record the only way he knew how, by refusing to let it be empty. I will not let his name be empty either. Thomas Aldrich, born 1869, cataloguer, the spectacled man in the annex, who knew where everything was, and who wrote down, for us, the things he was not allowed to keep. They could transfer the crates. They could orphan the numbers. They could let the bones crumble to dust, or say they did. But they could not reach into a boarding house box 100 years later and erase the 4 words he wrote again and again in his even, patient hand. Transferred, not returned. The archive was never destroyed. It was only buried. Remember that. Because it is the thread that runs through every story I am going to tell you. The thing you are looking for is almost never gone. It is moved, it is held separate. It is given a number, and then orphaned, and then quietly walked out a door by a man with paperwork you are not allowed to copy. But it is not gone. Somewhere the long crate still sits. Somewhere the thread still has an end. The archive was never destroyed. It was only buried. And there is one more box I have to open for you, because Thomas Aldrich's ledgers were not the only thing in that 2007 estate. There were other papers, and one of them was a letter, not in Aldrich's hand, that mentions a house, a famous house, one of the great mansions of the Gilded Age, raised by one of the richest families this country has ever produced, the Vanderbilt Mansion, and a date, 1912. The letter refers to something found beneath it, during construction, or demolition, or excavation. The word is smudged. Something found under the floor of one of the most powerful families in America in 1912, and handled exactly the way Aldrich's crates were handled. Logged once, then silence. I have spent a year tracing it. I think I know what they found. Next time, I will show you. The archive was never destroyed, it was only buried. I will see you there.